Hello, everyone. Can anything? I heard some stuff, but I'm not hearing the audio from the Zoom.
Everybody, welcome to eRecords Management 2020 session. This is the IRMAC channel, the Information Resource Management Association of Canada. Welcome to those who are new. And this is our May session with our speaker on records management. My name is Deborah Henderson. I'm on the IRMAC board and I'll be your moderator today. We'll have Nick on the line who will be relaying your questions.
Oh, we're having some bad feedback loop.
Okay. Okay, so where shall I pick up, Nick?
Keep going. Sorry about that.
No problem. So I'm Deborah Henderson, and I will be your moderator today. Nick will be relaying questions from the Zoom channel, into our Zoom channel from YouTube as we live stream today's speaker, Anne Heppelwhite. Anne has worked in the field of public sector information management for the bulk of her careers. And she has a deep interest in telling authentic stories to people and organizations through original source material, led to formal training, and then to her graduate degree in archival studies. She's done research into provenance of municipal records, and it led Anne to explore being a certified records manager, change management certificate, and a project management professional. Anne believes in integrated information management, breaking down barriers between allied professions such as ourselves in the more structured data world, and learning how each specialty can complement community knowledge. She's an active member in ARMA, the professional association authority governing information as a strategic asset, and Anne is proud to serve as a chair of the Niagara Connects boards. In our world, in the IRMAC world, ARMA is a recognized voice for the unstructured or file-based data, and is a complement to the professional organization that we affiliate with and are recognized with, DAMA International, the data management professional organization. So the symbiosis is definitely here. And she'll be speaking today about the nature of records management. And then in the webinar here, we'll also discuss the term record and its myriad of interpretations, the importance of content, authenticity, reliability, and preservation. She will highlight current challenges and opportunities, including the issue of preserving links between data and records, which is of extreme importance to us all, and protecting personally identified information, PII, the privacy, as well as concepts of digital fragility. So thank you, Anne, for joining us today. And I'll stop my share now and ask you to start up.
Great, I'll share my screen. Okay, so Deb, I'd just like to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so everyone, I hope you're enjoying the tongue-in-cheek title of my talk today. Sensible Shoes and Pallet Jacks, My Adventures in Records Management. So I'd like to introduce myself and give you a little bit of context to this title. If I can change my slide, there we go. So that's me, back in the days of hair salons. I began my career in records and information management after graduating from the School of Library, Archives, and Information Studies at UBC in the late 90s. When I started my first real job as an archivist and records analyst at the City of Thunder Bay Archives and Records Center, I was really excited to start working with original records and to put some of the toolbox of theory that I'd learned into practice. I wanted to focus on preservation activities and help researchers with their reference questions. I'd been equipped with this little toolbox of formal education, and I reported on that first day gung-ho. I was issued a smock to protect my clothing from dust, and rolling up my sleeves, I was ready to go. My supervisor took me to the back storage area where the temperature noticeably dropped to preserve those records. And the storage boxes were stacked 14 feet high on industrial grade racking. The first job that I had on that first day was to assist in pulling records for destruction. The operational records custodian had recently signed off on a destruction listing. We had all of our paperwork in place. Had a printout from our records management database, which by the way was written in FoxPro at the time, indicating the box numbers and locations of all of those boxes ready for destruction. I was shown a wooden pallet, reviewed the destruction list with my colleague, and then I learned my instructions in pallet jack driving. It was not a glamorous day. I had to remove my beautiful spiked heels and put on proper, sensible work boots. And we spent that morning clearing the shelves and piling these boxes up onto pallets and moving them into a room where we had a big on-site shredder. I learned how to drive that pallet jack and realized in a moment that this job was going to have some variety, and some of it was going to be some tedium. I was going to learn something new every day. Some days I was going to be spending with a researcher, helping them delve into the history of a property. And some days I was going to spend my days physically moving boxes from place to place. I tell you that little anecdote because it reinforces for me that it was on that day that my true education began. Out in the record center, pulling the boxes eligible for destruction, I became part of the machinery making the life cycle work, and there was no better way to learn it. My life had gone from the theoretical to the practical, just like that. I saw those records destroyed by our giant on-site shredder, and they were truly never to be used again. Watching the paper enter the shredder as information with form and function, and to come out as illegible strips of recycling, reinforced quite starkly the concept that the decision to destroy a record is one that you can't take back. So when you undertake it, you must be sure. In that physical paper world, things were a little simpler than they are now. I still believe that it's important to destroy records on a regular basis, to account for the destruction of those records, and to be well aware of what is being destroyed and why it is being destroyed. The act of destruction serves to help its opposite activity. By culling the wheat from the chaff, we ensure that we have the resources and focus to provide access to and to preserve those records that preserve our rights, that tell our stories, and inform our futures. At that time, I knew that electronic records was going to be a big challenge in my career as a records manager. And today I'd like to give you some context about the challenges I've encountered and how I think the branches of the information management professions need to work together more closely to forge a way toward a stronger, evidence-informed future. Over the years, I've worked for a few different organizations and managed a few different records management programs. Most of my career has been in the municipal public sector, some of it working for law enforcement. I'm currently laid off from a wonderful job at the beautiful Niagara Parks Commission. But one of the common issues I've had to deal with in all of these workplaces is the reluctance of employees to meet with me and to talk about their records. This is partly because they've got some preconceived misconceptions about the role of the records manager. This is the stereotype I live with. Monsters, Inc. was one of my kids' favorite movies back in the early 2000s. In fact, I think we wore out our VHS tape from overuse. I couldn't resist showing this image of Roz, who is the quintessential humorless bureaucrat. But that's not me. I consider myself not the rule enforcer, the person who wants to peer through your drawers, take your stuff away, tell you how to do your work, or judge you. I want to be the enabler. Some of the things that I've run into over the years is people have said things like, "Hi, I'm Dave from HR. How long do I have to keep this stuff?" As if I had some psychic powers that could unravel the particular context of the stuff with no further information. What I want to do within the organization is much less destructive or mystical than what Dave had in mind. I'm trying to enable the workforce to use systems that will help them work more efficiently and use the information they have more effectively. To do so, we all need to work more collaboratively to understand what actions the records support and how those actions fit within the larger context of the organization, how long they need to be readily available for business consultation, and what potential consequences might arise from their destruction. These myths are being broken down at the same time that records managers have become uncomfortable using the very term records management to do their work or to describe their work. Records management professionals are increasingly omitting the word record from their job descriptions, preferring more modern and sexy words like information management. I'll be talking today about the centrality of the record to the work that I do. And I hope to start a conversation with many of you about collaboration from the information professions. So here goes. You may recognize this photo. It's a still from the final scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The scene shows the sacred Ark boxed up in a crate, being wheeled on a pallet jack, by the way, through a giant warehouse of similar boxes. The impression that you get is that the Ark is now lost again because it's not identified in any way. I don't see any numbered shelves. It's basically been committed to obscurity. This is what happens to your records in any storage facility, be it a warehouse, a SharePoint site, or a shared drive, if there are no clues leading you back to your carefully created content. Even the most talented treasure hunter is not going to help find this needle in a haystack. So part of our job is to put the supports in place to ensure that the Ark, your stuff, is properly classified and put in its place so that it may be retrieved when needed. But finding things is not the whole picture. So let's go down to the definition of records management. This is one that I just pulled off of Wikipedia. And I thought I'd pick that one because I wanted one that spoke to the broadest audience possible. An organizational function devoted to the management of information in an organization throughout its life cycle, from the time of creation or inscription to its eventual disposition. So records management tries to help the users employ tools, techniques, and systems to prevent their shared drives, SharePoint sites, email inboxes, and other questionable storage locations from becoming the raider's warehouse, a place where information is committed to practical obscurity. We also want to ensure that the information that is managed is trustworthy, authentic, and reliable. It's amazing to me that there are so many different definitions of records, and most of them do that thing that English teachers always told us not to do in describing things. They give a long list of the kinds of documents that might be considered a record, rather than focusing on the essence of what makes a document a record. These inconsistent definitions are smattered across Canadian legislation and create challenges for legislators, users, and the courts alike. The definition I've provided here attempts to cover the conditions that must be present for a document to be considered a record. So it starts with it being a document. It must be made or received in the regular course of business and then kept to fulfill administrative, operational, or historical purposes. I should add to that it could be also kept for fulfilling legal hold purposes. The last bit's important, that business of keeping, as we often create documents that are so fleeting in their usefulness that they are not kept for any length of time and can be discarded without being committed to the system of rules that make up the corporate records management program. These are often described as transitory records, and in most records management policies, documents that meet their definition may be destroyed without being accounted for. While a record can be a document that stands alone, it is most often part of a collection of documents, a file, or a dossier. Think of the process that's involved in developing a request for proposal, for example. The RFP itself is the product of a process that involves consultation, drafts, rewrites, review, correspondence, approvals, etc. The file that includes those documents tell the story of the RFP's development. And that file helps to authenticate the process by which a decision might have been made. I learned about records management when I was at school learning to be an archivist. I feel that the circumstances of my education and the route that I took to get there give me a bit of a different perspective on the records life cycle. One that looks at it kind of from the end, or the long view, as I like to think about it. Archivists are entrusted with describing the circumstances of a record's creation, its administrative history, and the context in which it came into being in order to give researchers the clues that they need in order to answer the questions that they bring to the records. Archival arrangement and description is a service provided to the researcher that functions to both contextualize and authenticate the records. This happens long after the record has served its primary use in supporting an action. The archivist gets the record as a memory of actions past. The records manager is the bridge between the business use of the record and its future life as a reference of actions past or potential recycling material. Ideally, the records manager works with the record creator within the business context to help leverage its maximum value to the organization, to make solid disposition decisions early in the life cycle, creating efficiencies that allow energy to be spent on preserving only those records that need to be preserved. In archival science, there's a concept called the archival bond, which I think is a useful concept for anyone interested in information governance. It refers to the relationship between the records that immediately precede and succeed each other within an activity. When records are physically arranged, it is tangible and easy to see. In an electronic environment, the archival bond may be discovered within the filing identifiers, within the metadata that constitute the data dictionary, within an automated business process, or within an electronic file. It is a principal determinant of the meaning of the document, as it is the intellectual connection between the document and the activity that gave rise to its existence. The records are more than their individual form and function. They also derive meaning from their function within a procedure or a process. These concepts were created by archivists working with physical records, but they are vitally relevant to the management of electronic records. This is a representation of the traditional records life cycle. And it is useful in understanding the 50,000-foot view of records retention focus. But new habits that have been made possible by digital environments disrupt this organization in fundamental ways. Our ways of working have changed and are no longer easily read as a linear narrative, but need to be understood as digital ecosystems with tangled roots and branches. Records and data within records can be extracted and repurposed in ways that were not initially intended when the record was created. This creates some challenges to traditional paradigms that govern privacy principles, for example. The challenges are not insurmountable, but they do require that each use of the information is examined within its own purpose, and that the ownership of personally identifiable information is respected in each instance or use. I'm going to go through each of the steps within the life cycle and then move on into the components of a records management program. So the first step in the life cycle is to capture or create the record. In records management, we deem a record to be created when it is made or received in the regular course of business. This means that if you receive a document from another organization and use it within your organization to complete an action or make a decision, it becomes your record and your responsibility for management. This concept is manifest in the way access to information legislation has interpreted its concepts of custody and control. Manage and maintain step. When I use this word, when I use the word system on this slide, I refer to both the functions of a software package that might help you manage the movement of records, but also the system of processes and protocols that govern the user's behavior in the context of the expectations of the organization. We know that records see most of their usefulness in the first 2 weeks post-creation, but that they need to be kept for longer periods, usually for reference, for audit, or for compliance purposes. How the record is filed, used, and retrieved to serve these functions can be made simple and efficient if it is part of a system. Retention and disposition. This phase includes a number of actions such as destruction or transfer to a permanent archive, and sometimes the reassessment of a retention period. One of the best policy tools in the pursuit of defensible disposition is the retention schedule, which sets out the lifecycle timelines. How long do we need to keep this category of record? The retention schedule should be based on business need and legislative imperatives. Many users of records wonder why we need to follow a process of defensible destruction, why we need to account for the destruction of records. They often feel that as the creators or primary users of the records, that they are the most qualified to make decisions about when the record should be destroyed. And in fact, usually they are. When crafting a records retention schedule, the users are the primary influencers in determining the timeline, as well as, of course, consulting regulatory requirements. The key, though, is that the disposition of records should be documented, approved by the organization's governing council, board, etc. And most importantly, it should be followed consistently. The regular disposition of records that have met their timelines should be embedded as a regular part of the business of the organization. If an organization only occasionally follows its retention schedule, things can start to look a bit fishy. And I think some good examples of this are the Arthur Andersen scandal that occurred in the late 90s, which gave rise to Sarbanes-Oxley legislation.
Question, Anne. It's
Yes.
Deborah here.
Yeah.
This also brings to mind the Ontario gas plant scandal.
Yes.
And the I'm reading up again on Wikipedia about that. And apparently there were profound protocol violations of the Record Keeping Act and Freedom of Information and Protection Act in Ontario. And it led to some convictions. It comes back down to perhaps the individual evaluation of a record. And I know in my working life. I've never had to deal with tagging something on storage. And yet you're saying that it's up to the person in the business to identify and disposition for retention and disposal, give those guidelines on each of their records. How do you find compliance in normal organizations? Is it more in the legal area that you find this imperative, or because I've never found it in my working life?
It's a great
in the public sector. Yeah,
it's a really good question, Deborah. I have to say that probably the best compliance that I ever found was in that first job I had at the City of Thunder Bay. And when I say that users should be the primary influencers, I mean that users should be consulted in the crafting of a retention schedule. So when I joined the Niagara Parks Commission in 2015, they had never had a formal records management system before. It doesn't mean that they didn't manage their records. It's that they didn't do it consistently across the organization. So I embarked on a large scale consultation tour of most of the departments. And so what I ended up doing was visiting people and asking them, how do you use your records? And then evaluated the legislation that impacted each of those areas so that I could come up with, after about a year, their first retention schedule that we took into policy. But I've got to say that the compliance is still a really, really tough,
sorry, and you have, if you can hear me, we can't hear you right now. And
looks like your
out.
mic cut out.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
there you are,
Okay.
Anne.
I don't know what happened there. I ended up plugging my headphones in and out again. So I hope that doesn't happen again. But what I was saying was that I think that compliance really is one of the trickiest things, unfortunately. And I think it goes back to what I was saying before about how records managers are in large part moving away from the term records management. It's because we get no respect. And I think that it's seen to be somewhat of an old-fashioned kind of thing. However, as Deb commented, when records are destroyed outside of the rules and when the rules aren't followed consistently, it can lead to jail time. So
yes, and it did with the gas plant scandal.
That's right. Right.
One fellow was convicted of tampering with data, and that was due to the erasure of hard drives in the Premier's office.
Yes, and that's also, there was definitely a reason to believe that they were covering something up, right? And so adhering to the retention schedule consistently and predictably can show that that you follow these governance guidelines and respect the turnover. Never mind that regularly doing your destruction on a regular basis makes it become part of the regular course of business and not such a big effort each year. I am slowly in my job at Niagara Parks trying to work through about 130 years worth of storage. People who have kept records much longer than necessary because they didn't want to get rid of anything inappropriately. So it's cutting that wheat from the chaff. Have I answered that question? Okay, Deb, can I move on to preservation?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so the next step in the life cycle, once we've decided whether we're going to retain or dispose of the records, is preservation. If we decide that the records are not being destroyed, then the organization has a responsibility to allocate the resources necessary to preserve those records for the long term. For digital records, which can be surprisingly fragile, this introduces new complexities, such as the requirement for a digital preservation strategy. Now, I'm just going to go through some of the components that I think are necessary for a records management program to be effective. First, we need accountability. You can't simply hire a records manager and expect them to wiggle their nose and have the organization adopt the system that person puts forward. It needs to be identified as a corporate priority and endorsed at a high level within the organization. Like any organizational change, the executive level support needs to be active and it needs to be visible. Next is transparency. The processes and activities of managing records needs to be properly documented. This documentation is covered in the high-level policy, in the how-to procedures, within system, and within training documentation. It goes from the very, very highest level of what the organization intends down to how the organization intends to execute it. Integrity. One of the purposes of the program is to ensure that information is authentic and reliable. These concepts need to be communicated and discussed in the rollout and maintenance of any system. So, for example, in introducing a new financial management system, conversations should be had with the design team, the implementation team, to embed procedures that ensure authenticity and reliability. If this is done in the design phase, then headaches will be avoided down the line, and you can include it in the training throughout your rollout. Protection. Protection is the component that introduces the concept of private and confidential information. Private information normally refers to information that is personally identifiable, and confidential information is that information that is corporately sensitive or commercially sensitive and requires protecting. Privacy officers may or may not be part of the records management program or the records management team, but they must work very closely together as the management of information has great implications to how the information is protected. I've often incorporated privacy guidelines into classification schemes, for example, because at the user level, people want one document to govern how they use their records. The next one is compliance. The retention schedule should have all citations that refer to legal obligations included in its body. This helps people to understand why particular timelines exist. If they don't think that they reflect the business need, if there is a regulation that overrides that, then it should be documented. Availability. We need to maintain our records in a manner that ensures timely and efficient retrieval. This includes applying classification and also providing accessibility. Retention. the timelines that respect the amount of time that the records need to be available. Records management is concerned with maintaining those records that help the business and with removing those items that could bog down efficiency. Finally, disposition. The disposition decision could be to destroy or to transfer the records to the archives. And just as an aside, generally speaking, only between 5 and 8% of an organization's records usually end up being transferred to the archives. Most records have a much shorter timeline for which they are useful.
And a quick question from someone in our chat.
Yeah.
They're asking, I also find that record retention enforcement is difficult. Do you have any examples on how it works or should work? The rules start becoming very complex when that data holds relationships.
Can you repeat that last part, Nick?
The rules start becoming very complex when that data holds relationships. I'm guessing to other things, and so they're connected to multiple people and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely.
And I'm actually going to get into discussions of records within their context and with their relationships a little bit further. But yes, I mean, the disposition decision really has to go back to understanding that record within its context. Within the processes and procedures that it supports. It cannot be taken out kind of and looked at outside of that context. If you do that, then you risk breaking some of those relationships and leaving orphans. And we don't want to do that. So the records really have to be understood within the ecosystem that brought them into being. So I'm going to leave that question for now. I'll go on to the rest of the discussion, but if we want to bring it back for later, let's make sure we do that, okay? It's a little bit strange doing this without being able to make eye contact. So
that is unfortunately the way we have it now, isn't it? But I'll let you get back to it.
Okay. So the records disposition policy and schedule is really a tool that we use to provide clear directives for the creation, storage, and disposition of the records, and also to establish clear authority and responsibility, delineating the roles within the life cycle of a record. So that authority, that may come down to saying if the record's creator, the record's user is responsible for transferring it or committing it to an electronic document and records management system, for example. But the responsibility for identifying the records for destruction is that of the records manager. All of that needs to be included within the records retention and disposition policy. I just wanted to hit really quickly on privacy and the tool of privacy impact assessments. They situate the records that include personally identifiable information within the context of use for that organization, and also within the context of transmission, encryption, in transit and at rest, as well as storage. When we do a privacy impact assessment, some of the questions that we ask of the users is, how do you use these records? What do you want to achieve using these records? And these are the same kinds of questions that we ask when we're doing our retention evaluations. These activities, in my opinion, really do exist hand in glove and are important for really understanding how those relationships exist so that we can make those proper retention decisions. What that all means is really that understanding the record's external environment is also crucial at understanding its meaning and value to the organization. Context is what pulls everything together and gives it its situational importance. Archival science uses the concept of administrative history to describe the context of a group of records and how it came to be. And of course, the archivist has the luxury of looking at it from the past, whereas the records manager has to be kind of understanding that on the ground in the game. But this exercise helps to provide the researcher with an understanding of the records within the context of their creation, what outside forces may have influenced their character. All of this information is used by the researcher to further understand the history being studied. An administrative history will describe the organization that created the records, any predecessor organizations, and explain its genesis and development. And I've just provided a link there to Archives Canada, which is the Canadian National Union List for archives. If you were to pop onto that particular website, you'd be able to see how it is the archivist describes the records within context. Next is classification. So function-based classification posits that the records should be classified according to what they do, not the content that they contain. This flies in the face of what most people are quite comfortable with, which is subject-based classification. And it takes a little bit of time to get comfortable with this international standard of functional classification, because subject-based classification is really what we're used to. It's how we classify records in published collections, such as libraries. But there's a good reason for using functional classification in describing records. It creates the opportunity to pull together the process and the procedure that authenticates the record and describes it based on action. So ISO 15489, the international standard for records management, identifies functional classification as its preferred method for classification. One of the main advantages of functional classification is that it remains intact even as organizational structures change. So, for example, health and safety may have reported at one time to human resources, but then it was moved to an engineering department. Reclassifying records that relate to the same function but have changed reporting structure is not efficient. The names of the organizational unit may change within regimes or leadership, but the underlying business function or the activities that the records support always stays the same. So while this is a departure from traditional subject-based classification, which tried to analyze what the record was about versus what action it supports, it's more fluid and works better. It's more agile within an organization. Subject-based classification works really well for secondary sources and publications that draw information together about a specific topic, but it doesn't work as well for records, which are really, they're really the documentary residue of our actions. We don't create records just for the sake of it. There's always a reason. On to authenticity. Central to the work of the records manager is ensuring that the records can be relied upon to support the action that they are documenting. We're concerned with ensuring that the records we care for can be used as evidence of action, taken or not taken. One of the tools used by archivists is the study of diplomatics. It's a discipline developed by medieval monks to detect forgeries. And it's a very complex discipline, but has great potential in the realm of born digital records. It is the study of the creation, form, and transmission of records and their relationship to the facts represented in them and to their creator in order to identify, evaluate, and communicate their nature and authenticity. This definition I borrowed from Luciana Duranti, who is the former chair of the School of Library and Information Studies at UBC. And Luciana is recognized internationally as an expert on the study of diplomatics and its use in the preservation of electronic records. Diplomatics uses the elements of the record, its form and function, as well as the procedure that led to the creation of the record to authenticate it. If you think of the metadata that's used in the transmission of an email, you can begin to uncover all of the steps that are undertaken to take the message from its sender to its recipient. It's wrapped up in all the code that creates readable text, gets routed from server to server, and reaches its destination, where it may be further manipulated and rerouted. All of this information is useful in the field of digital forensics and for the records manager in figuring out context and authenticity. So metadata is our friend, and sometimes also our foe. Trustworthiness is, well, how do I even say it? In the world of fake news, it really continues to be a concern. With the prevalence of cloud services, the issues of ownership of information can really become blurred. Just to ask, do you trust your records that you keep online? Do you read the terms of service when you enter into an agreement with a cloud provider? We know that records can be altered. We know that their context can be distorted and made to misrepresent the original intention. And as self-service and convenient access to information becomes more and more prevalent, the trustworthiness of our original sources, especially if we're putting those sources forward as evidence of the action of an organization, is absolutely paramount. So putting in place those procedures, again, it really, I think, comes down to human behavior, is really important in making sure that the records that we have are authentic, reliable, and trustworthy. And I'll go back to that last piece in the records life cycle, which is preservation. One of the previous slides was a representation of the records life cycle, which is a linear process that breaks into a decision at the end. Essentially, toss or keep. If the decision is toss, the records manager will have recorded the amount of time that is prudent to keep the records based on business need and regulatory compliance, and the records will be destroyed. If the decision is keep, the organization has taken on the commitment to preserve those records over time and has to put some effort into ensuring that they are accessible over time. We know that preservation decisions, if made very early in the life cycle, can be very effective. For example, and I'll go back to the paper days, we know that minutes of an organization are permanent. And we can ensure that if they're printed on high cotton content, acid-free paper and stored in a room with appropriate environmental controls, in order that they are accessible for many years into the future, that they likely will be. Building that preservation into our processes and into our design will really serve us into the future.
Question, Anne?
Yes.
Yeah.
We have Deborah, you go first.
Oh, okay. Sure. I have a question about e-discovery, which is trying to find out for, I guess, court purposes, information relating to, say, a lawsuit that's come up. I mean, how does one know in a preservation decision whether in fact you might be sued for something going forward? I mean, it's almost impossible to predict.
Yeah.
Not? And isn't that one of the complications? And how is that addressed?
So it is impossible to predict. And that's where your retention schedule really saves your bacon. Because if you have one that is based and grounded firmly in business need and regulatory compliance, and you destroy your records predictably in accordance with your retention schedule, and you end up being sued, and you are able to show that the records that are discoverable have been destroyed appropriately under schedule, then that is acceptable.
I see. Okay.
Yeah,
but makes sense.
If you have records that are not yet destroyed, but they are under schedule, and you get a production notice, for example, at that point you've got to have the processes in place to put a legal hold on those documents and ensure that they are pulled back from the process of destruction. So there is some complexity involved in that process.
Thank you.
And now for the question from the YouTube comments.
Okay.
Do you think that record trust is what has evolved in the data world as data quality practices?
I don't know. It's a good question, but I would only be guessing because I'm not in that world. I think that certainly data quality practices, if I am making the correct assumptions, certainly have an impact on the trustworthiness of records. But I think that it also comes down to that sense of inappropriate destruction and misrepresentation that I think that we're seeing so much about right now in the media.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much.
So I'm getting close to wrapping up the formal slides, but I'd like to chat for a bit about preservation risks, specifically in the digital world. We run into issues of digital fragility, and I think that these are really going to come out more and more in the next few years. So of course, we've been dealing with data or format obsolescence for some time. Anyone who lived in the world of WordPerfect or Quattro Pro and didn't do any migration certainly has lived with that. And dealing with hardware that will no longer read our storage media, such as our jump drives or even our former floppy disks. But link rot and content drift, I think, is becoming a really huge concern. So the links that we've embedded within documents fall apart, or the content is moved, and we end up essentially losing our link to the content that we needed. Vendor abandonment is a big concern for cloud storage services. What are you to do if all of a sudden your provider goes bankrupt tomorrow and you're no longer able to access your content? And then digital rights management, I think, is an important consideration in all of these points. That said, I think that there's an awful lot of opportunity that exists. I really believe that it's time for the information professions to get together, to talk more, to collaborate. We have different perspectives, even on the definition of what a record is. And it takes patience to work through those differences so that we can arrive at common understanding. At the end of the day, I think it's so worth it. That question that came up earlier about data quality and the trustworthiness of records, I don't know the answer, but I'd really like to pursue the question. So many organizations, big and small, for-profit and not-for-profit, are being told to use data to tell their stories. And frankly, they don't know how. Not all of them know how. We need translators. We need people who can work with the data, work with the people, to tell the stories and to navigate these new and very exciting waters. I think that we can start to build networks of people that can really weave tapestries that are rich with meaning. And we can start to find our way to a new information profession. I know the one thing is certain, and that is change. It's constant and it's inevitable. As tech changes, we also have to change our behaviors and habits to keep up. Very, very little am I pulling boxes from shelves to go into a shredder these days. Most of my destruction decisions happen using an enterprise content management system. But we still have so many questions and so many issues to sort out. And I believe that all of us are definitely smarter than one of us. And with that, I will end my slides and say thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. That was a really informative talk, and I personally gained a lot of new words in my vocabulary from that talk, including link rot and diplomatics, which I had never heard of before. I'd like to turn now to the audience and see if there's any more questions. Is there any more questions coming from there, Nick?
In fact, we just got one right now. Should we promote record governance similarly to the TCP/IP model, where every record everywhere has an absolute unique ID, including ownership and stewardship?
I don't think so. I think that records should be understood in their aggregates and as part of a system. But then again, I don't know. Maybe they should. Certainly a record within a database should have that kind of identification. So here I am talking in a complete circle.
I mean, I can understand where you're coming from, where a database also inherently comes with these ID keys to file to every single thing, so it makes sense in a way. But ownership and stewardship seems like a more complicated depth to take. Would it be a person or a team or a department?
Well, I think that, you know, the way that I've dealt with the concepts of ownership and stewardship has certainly been within those policies, dealing with the, you know, corporate responsibility within the roles. So one of the things that I've tried to do within my organization is to have stewardship of information included within performance management, so that you're not only judged on how it is that you might deal with your financial resources, but also with your information resources. I think that could be a way forward. I think that it's something that still isn't in the forefront of people's minds. I don't think that everyone in an organization really understands information as a strategic asset. And I think that we've got a lot of work to do to bring that forward.
Okay, and now we have another question, if you're comfortable answering some more.
You got me.
How would you deal with removing records from structured data repositories where removal may cause issues to the application?
I wouldn't do it. So I think that this might have some context in the some of the changes to FIPA, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, where there's some requirement to remove personally identifiable information from databases. But if that removal breaks a link, I think that we should be looking at other ways in which that we can protect that personally identifiable information. And the former Information Privacy Commissioner, Ann Cavoukian, she would always say that we should approach these decisions at the design stage. She, I think, patented the term privacy by design, and that we should build in privacy practices into the way in which we work. Now, that's all well and good to say as we build new things, but in dealing with legacy data and legacy records, it's much more difficult. So, I think that we really have to be cognizant of if we're trying to fulfill one kind of corporate good, that we don't create a new problem.
Okay.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I have another question here. You said early on that the title records manager has been falling away, and perhaps people are using the title information manager to get some more respect. And I'm wondering, aren't your best friends in organizations lawyers and the financial departments? I mean, they're heavily regulated, and they should, have, you should be tightly affiliated with them, and they should be your best friends.
They should.
Right.
I'm just noticing in ARMA, for example, the new designation is the information governance professional, whereas I'm an old school CRM, a certified records manager. But yeah, I mean, really, those governance questions really should be upheld by legal and finance. I actually had a conversation many years ago with a former finance director, in which I said to him, you want me to account for every single expenditure that I make and give it a number, but you don't want to take that same kind of care with the records that you produce. And I think that we're still fighting that battle. They don't see it in the same light.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and now we got another one coming in from our YouTube comments. Given the continuous change in the laws of records management, preservation, and privacy, how do you keep up with the information resources to maintain or remove documents in your work?
How do I keep up? Well, I activate my network, that's for sure. So I work with ARMA, and also within my own particular context, I work with other records managers within the Ontario Public Service. But it is a challenge, and we rely on that network and with our colleagues in order to stay abreast of changes. Now, one of the things that comes up with records management is that you've got to be on top of the legislation, not only from an information management perspective, but sometimes you've got to know when shifts change within other kinds of legislation, so environmental or homes for the aged or what have you. And usually when some major change like that happens, it will filter through our networks. But it is tricky because there isn't one source for all of that information, unless you're going to subscribe to a service that provides that.
I also imagine that you can kind of see some of these laws and stuff coming from a mile away, so you have time to think about it, and then they'll also give you maybe some grandfathered in time to update your systems after it comes into effect as well. So that might help, I guess.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so it looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment coming in online.
Right, and so I guess that's a wrap then. So thanks so much for your time and your expertise and sharing today with us, Anne. And I think your audience totally believes in your, your opportunities list, which is to work more collaboratively in the future. And I'm personally hopeful for that, and think that as technology evolves, there'll be more collaboration possible between the content record side and the more structured data side. So thank you very much again for your time today, and thank you everybody on the YouTube side.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to invite anyone who'd like to continue the conversation to connect with me on LinkedIn.
Right. Have a good evening, everyone.